This is ego-utilitarianism, and this presentation is a summary of the labor theory of value. Um, I'm entitling it "The Labor Theory of Value for Dummies." So I tried to essentially boil it down to the essential arguments of the labor theory of value. Okay, so the labor theory of value says the value of a good is derived from the labor inputs that went into that good's production. This is wrong because it's the relative value of a good that determines how much labor and other resources go into producing that good. If value were truly determined by labor inputs, producers would never be concerned with making a profit or avoiding loss, since they would be guaranteed to recoup all the costs of producing that good. What you don't see is the vast majority of goods that aren't brought to market because they were thought to be unprofitable, meaning it wasn't worth the labor that would have went into them, at least if you adopt the labor theory of value, since all inputs somehow are attributed to labor. The intrinsic or objective theory of value says the properties of a good solely determine its value. This is wrong because the abilities of the consumer to utilize the properties of the good are just as important in determining the value of the good. The subjective theory of value says the only thing that matters in determining the value of a good is the consumer's mind, and rejects the importance of the properties of the good. This is wrong because the mind is trying to determine relative value. Given the mind is composed of imperfect information and imperfect intelligence to process this information, the likelihood of error in determining the relative value of a good is virtually certain. The relative theory of value says that all value is relative. The value of a good to a consumer is just a subset of all value. The value of a good to a particular consumer is the marginal utility extracted by the consumer after consumption or utilization of the good to satisfy a goal. This result is consequential. The subjective valuation of a good is the expected marginal utility before consumption. This implies the relative value of a good to a consumer is dependent upon the inherent properties of the good. If the goal of the consumer is to insulate against cold weather, then it is not up to the consumer's mind on how well a certain material, cotton, down, plastic, or metal, can satisfy this goal, since this ability is inherent in the good itself, and therefore merely an objective fact. The consumer is trying to ascertain each material's ability to retain body heat and select the best material for their purpose. They don't have perfect knowledge and can and often make mistakes. It makes no sense to refer to the value of a good without the perspective or state and not the mind of the consumer. It's analogous to asking what is the state of water without providing a temperature. The important aspects of the state of the consumer that is necessary in determining the relative value of a good include the consumer's ability to utilize the good towards these goals. The consumer variable is the state of the consumer. It has no direct relation to the consumer's mind, making it non-subjective. Just like height, weight, or age of a person, the objectives, abilities, and external conditions of the consumer are relative and not subjective, meaning it's not dependent upon their mind. Just like height, weight, and age, they vary from person to person, but are not dependent upon mind. So are the objectives once they're set. Their abilities and the external conditions of the consumer are also relative, just in the same way. Like a chemical reaction between reactants, the relative value of a good to a consumer is a reaction of the inherent properties of the good and the abilities of the consumer to use the good to accomplish a goal. So, to sum things up, relative value of a good to a consumer can be written as a function, the R function, dependent upon two variables, the inherent properties of a good and a particular consumer. And by particular consumer, I mean their goals and abilities. It has nothing to do with their mind once the goal is set. Because consuming a good is a two-part sequence, right? You have to first establish a goal. Once that goal is established, it becomes an objective fact. And at that point, also the abilities are already determined. So once those two are already determined, the particular consumer variable becomes completely non-subjective. In other words, objective. Okay, so this is the summary of the relative theory of value. I left a link in the comment section below to this outline where you'll have access to it from my blog, Ego Utilitarianism, at WordPress. So like, comment, subscribe, criticize, share. I'd appreciate some input. If you think you see any logical contradictions, say so. And if you have any if you want me to explain anything further, like maybe you have some confusion somewhere, feel free to let me know and I'll respond.